Decades ago, I started growing food in my front and backyard, and I realized that my mission in life is to inspire and empower others to grow their own nutrient-dense, healthy organic food. Because of this, a lot of people have come to me with their gardening questions over the years, and that got me thinking, what if we put together a community that would help budding gardeners blossom? So I finally made the idea a reality with my Urban Farm U member program. Each month, your membership includes 3 live online events, a monthly class, a chit-chat with an expert, and a monthly coaching session, plus access to the experts on our member page and a significant discount on our signature courses. I'm deeply committed to transforming our global food system, and I do this by empowering you to grow your own food. The Urban Farm membership program is a simple way to get going. Please join me in transforming your food system today. To learn more, go to urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444. That's urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the Grow Your Own Food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have Forrest Shomer of Inside Passage Seeds to talk about growing, collecting, and selling seeds. Forrest started urban farming in 1969 in Berkeley, California. Through the People's Park movement, he was launched into gardening and got the basic training and motivation for becoming a seedman. He has been a full-time, independent, professional seed provider since 1972 and has owned, led, or helped launch at least 4 seed companies and founded the nonprofit Abundant Life Seed Foundation, which produced and distributed up to 600 types of open-pollinated vegetable, herb, and flower seeds. Since 1974, Forrest has been giving workshops on seed saving and the importance of genetic diversity, and was the keynote speaker for the 2012 Northwest Permaculture Convergence and also the Regenerations Seed and Plant Exchange in Hawaii. Forrest had a radio show for a couple of years with 30-minute interviews featuring a variety of people, including many permaculturists. Welcome to the show today, Forrest.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to be here with you.
Absolutely. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at now?
I think I'll go back even a little bit before the People's Park movement and then swing into that.
Perfect.
I grew up in Chicago, and Chicago has a motto, which I think all school kids learn at some point, and it is Latin, urbs in horto. That means city in a garden. So I would say that very early on, I was impressed by the idea of a city being a green space. And we had that heritage because it was designed into the city as it grew. The parks and the boulevard system were, world renowned, and they still are, I'm sure, to some degree. And growing up in that environment, I guess I just wanted to go out and make it better.
Yeah.
So I wound up as a city planning student and went to graduate school in Berkeley and UC Berkeley, and I just happened to land there right about the time that the People's Park movement really exploded overnight into the right into the thick of the urban setting. 3 blocks off campus from where I was doing my studies, people took over a vacant block that belonged to the university for redevelopment. There had been just a big mud puddle for years with people parking cars randomly on it, and there weren't any other neighborhood parks. So the community just, people in Berkeley will do.
They just took it over?
Took it over, and
nice.
Overnight we rolled out sod for lawns. We planted flowers.
Oh my gosh.
People came, played music there, which was at that time very uncommon in the street. And then there'd be like a big galvanized 55-gallon drum with stew cooking in it, and it would feed hundreds of people, and everybody started to bring food to it. So it was like an enormous potluck.
Wow.
And this went on for 6 weeks. And then overnight, the governor called in the National Guard, put up a chain link fence around it, and posted the guardsmen there to keep the community from tearing the fence down. Well, the short version of it is there were some riots and marches and a lot of incidents around that. And after a couple of weeks, things kind of settled down. Everybody went home for the summer. And a few of us were left waiting for what do we do now? And at that point, I was found by an elderly garden writer, teacher named Lucy Hupp. She came over from a suburban little acre that she had not too far away from Berkeley, and she would come into town once a week, pick up about 4 or 5 of us that she saw as prospects, and took us out there and taught us how to garden, how to prepare food, canning, flower cutting, herb collection. And one of the important things for me was she showed me how to collect seeds. I remember the very first thing that she showed me was Love in a Mist, which is Nigella. And it comes in a sort of a shaker. When the pod opens up, it's real easy to just shake the seeds out. And I thought, I really like this part. That led to kind of a keynote for me as I moved more into gardening. I moved from there. Ultimately, I was in Seattle within about 2 years, gardening and starting to collect seeds. And at that time, I was also managing the first independent natural food store in Seattle. That was early in 1972 or late in 1971.
Wow.
And I thought it would be really great if, other than just having people come here and buy stuff from us, that we could be helpful in getting them started on growing their own. Not a common practice in the early 70s.
Absolutely. That is
So I went down to the Pike Street Market where there was a little seed shop that had been there for almost 100 years. And it was in the process of closing. The economy had shifted and they just weren't making it anymore, or maybe the older generation had died off. So they liked the idea that I was going to start a seed company, and they gave me their little packaging scoops, which are like 4 grams, 7 grams, these little different measures. And I figured out then which ones matched up with which vegetables, and proceeded to start packaging in little envelopes. The envelopes were hand stamped, and the first round of them back in 72 were 8 cents a packet.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, that's how things were before inflation.
Right.
So, and then really interesting to me when some of the scoops got lost, and I thought, well, how am I going to replace them? I found out that gun shells are exactly the same size as these little scoops were.
Oh, interesting.
Which were made out of brass.
Yeah.
So I had someone in the jewelry trade make me these little scoops out of gun shells. So you could call it, swords into plowshares.
Nice.
And I still have some of those scoops. Now it's 40 some years later, and I still use them almost daily. So I feel like just the magnetism of what they've been through, over 100 years old. Yeah. They've seen millions of seeds pass through, and they kind of bring, you could say, a vibration to what follows, kind of put their little blessing on the seed packets.
Nice. So that was in the early 70s.
Right. So we did display quite a selection of open-pollinated seeds that I was able to buy in the seed market with no mercury or other treatments on them. And that became my objective, was to keep the seeds as pure as possible and as possible for people to raise their own seed from that, which they would not be able to do with hybrid seeds. At that time, there were no GM seeds yet, and plant patenting protection didn't come until 1980.
Right.
So it was really being sort of a seed bank for anyone who was aware of the possibility of growing their own seeds.
Yeah.
Of course, that begged the question of, how do you grow your own seeds? So within 2 years, I was giving workshops. And for quite a while after that, through the Abundant Life Seed Foundation, which was a nonprofit 501c3, tax exempt, went around the region and beyond doing these workshops, and did over 200 of them. It's kind of my road show.
Uh-huh.
And I
Nice.
still do workshops, although not as often. And I tend to go more for what I do now, which is working with native plants rather than garden vegetables.
Uh-huh.
But I can still do that. And in fact, 2 years ago, I did a little tour in Turkey that was set up by permaculture friends doing seed workshops as I went around that country.
Uh-huh.
And I've done the same thing in Argentina, Chile, and Colombia.
Where you travel there and collect seeds?
Not so much collect, but meet up with groups of interested people that had no idea that they could be growing their own seeds, or
Uh-huh.
they had some idea but needed more hands-on training, and just went in and did my little workshop in their midst using their plants so that they would have that sense of confidence that
Yeah.
they don't have to depend on some mass market and maybe government controlled in some countries opportunity to grow their own
To
vegetables.
grow your own seeds. A lot of people don't know that, you know, plants basically when they flower and then they go to seed and then you can save those seeds.
Exactly. That's where the cycle
Is it that
begins
simple?
to recycle.
Yeah, is it that simple?
Well, there's know-how. First of all, there's hands-on skills, and the second and more important thing really is understanding how pollination works so that you get the result you want from the seeds that you save.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you save something that is a species, I'll give you an example of an herb. Let's say lemon balm, Melissa officinalis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's only one Melissa species out there that people are going to be growing. So when you save that seed, you get lemon balm. But if you save a cabbage, Brassica oleracea, you've got so many different kinds that can
Right.
cross with each other because
Mm-hmm.
they're all selections from the original wild cabbage.
Right.
That would be cauliflower, broccoli, kohlrabi, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and others. And the possibility of you getting not the result you would hope for requires that you get educated about more challenging plants like that.
Yeah, a little bit. And I mean, it can be as simple as a few years ago, I put Swiss chard and beets right next to each other and let them go to seed, and I collected their seeds. What happened?
They crossed.
They crossed. And so when I replanted them, I wasn't getting the results that I was expecting.
Right. So we need skill and we need knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. And generally speaking, the seed saving part is really just letting your plants go to seed and then collecting the seeds, yes?
That's most of it.
Yeah.
So I'll give the example of some really easy ones.
Please.
And the easiest ones are annuals.
Uh-huh.
So annuals do represent most of the food plants that we grow. And
Yep.
if we put aside for right now conversation about grains, which most people won't be growing,
Right.
the easy annuals that people save are things like tomato, beans, peas, corn, peppers, sunflowers. These tend to be larger seeds, so they're real easy to handle.
Right.
Children can figure it out right away.
Yeah.
And crossing between different varieties is the main thing that you want to be educated about. So, for example, with corn, which is wind pollinated, you have to consider if you have more than one variety, or if your neighbor has a different variety, and
Yeah.
the wind is blowing your way, then there might be some mixing, but there are lots of tricks. So, for example, if you have an early corn and a late corn, they won't cross-pollinate each other.
Oh, right.
If you have a prevailing wind that always comes from the same direction at the time the tassels are forming, the chances are really good that you can plant, let's say it's a west wind, so you have maybe a garden 100 or 200 feet long, so you plant one at the north end and one at the south end, and they won't cross.
Yeah.
You can plant a trap crop, which is something tall that would interfere with the heavy corn pollen from blowing over, like sunflowers, pole beans, Jerusalem artichokes. So there's many little tricks like that if you want to add more diversity, but certainly as a beginner, one would want to just try to grow maybe one of a kind and see how that works and get some skill. And then branch out from there.
Yeah, and I've been doing it for years, and generally if I'm saving seeds, that's what I do. I grow one kind of tomato, I isolate it in my yard, and then save the seeds from it.
Exactly. And the other option, if you're thinking of it in terms of broader diversity, is networking. So you get together with 2, 3, or a dozen other people, maybe in different neighborhoods,
Yep.
and kind of farm out the different varieties to where people can help each other by growing the seeds separately and then offering them to each other in
And
an
sharing
exchange.
seeds. Nice. Nice. So you've actually said several different things that I kind of want you to address. Some of them are simple, like tell everybody what an annual is.
Well, that's a plant that typically is planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. And then by the time it's completed its annual cycle, it has made ripe seed. And then it would be not grown in the winter.
Right.
There might be exceptions, such as around Phoenix, you've got year-round growing conditions for even annuals.
Yeah.
But most people probably who will listen to this are in places where there's a frost or even colder weather, maybe snowy weather, and they have to put their annuals aside for the winter and start again next year. So for them, it's really important to be able to save those seeds and replant some months later.
Interesting, here in the desert, we put our annuals away in the summer. A lot of them. So, and then you mentioned, you used several terms around seeds. You said open-pollinated, you said hybrid, and you said GM. So can you kind of unpack those a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
So open-pollinated is the way that plants were grown exclusively up until about 70 or 80 years ago, meaning the natural vectors for pollination, which would be wind, water, and pollinating insects or birds. That would include sometimes even moths or even little crawling things like ants.
Yeah.
All contribute to the pollination which precedes the formation of the seed. What changed about 80 years ago was that people who had studied genetics started to realize they could mingle two species. And a very simple example would be to grow two corn varieties side by side so that the pollen could move freely from one to the other. And then the result might be something that, let's say that one was blue and one was white, so you might get a speckled corn the next year.
Nice.
Or you might be able to, the word that they use is emasculate, which means remove the male part of one variety so that only the second variety provides the male pollen for the silks.
Right.
Thereby you could take a quality from the second variety that's providing the male pollen, let's say earliness,
right,
and mingle it with the other variety that might have a different quality like productivity. So each person growing who wants to do that becomes a plant breeder and is creating what suits them the best, rather than just accepting uniform varieties that are grown on large acreages by seed companies. And it's certainly the more interesting, the more fun part of growing is that you can grow your own varieties.
And this is called a hybrid, right?
That's the explanation, a simple explanation for a hybrid. So it's no longer open-pollinated because when you remove the males from one variety, you change the situation to a control rather than an open-pollinated. And that, I won't say one's better than the other, but they're very different for sure.
Yeah.
What happened in the seed trade was that companies saw that they could create their own hybrids and then have total control over the distribution of those hybrids and thereby make more money. So that was the motivation for that. Well, by 1980, there was something introduced called plant variety protection, which was a patenting and allowed companies to totally control the distribution of the varieties that they were creating. And then what followed that about 10 years later was GM was genetically modified, meaning that the seeds had actually been changed under laboratory conditions by going into their mitochondria and swapping genes so that you could introduce a gene from a different variety in a way that might not occur just by nature's vectors, the pollinators and so forth. So now we're at the stage which seems like the ultimate stage of that development of going from nature happily doing what she does in the field to totally controlling in specified, predictable conditions that can be marketed in an exclusive sort of a way.
Yeah. And now this whole GM thing, that doesn't happen in nature, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Great. So generally speaking, are GM crops available for us end users?
Well, for sure. In certain kinds of plants, in particular, the ones that could be exploited the most for profit. So we see some GM crops. The most common ones are, of course, corn and soybeans, which are grown on massive scale, but that's not something that you and I would have in our backyard.
Right. And that's what I was speaking to.
Right. So for the consumer, the small gardener, the urban farmer, there are not that many GM varieties in the marketplace, but certainly there are some. And a typical vegetable seed catalog will identify those. It really should, in any case.
Right.
So that it tells you that you can't save seed from this. If you were thinking of doing that, forget about it. But more importantly for me, I think, and many others, it's a concern about what is the food quality of that genetically modified plant.
Right.
Is there a hidden downside to it that is reflected in human health? And therefore, I really want to know when I plant a seed if it's genetically modified, because I might perhaps choose not to grow it out of concern for the health aspect that hasn't been fully explored.
Yeah, exactly. So can you tell us about your Inside Passage Seed Company? What do you do? You're collecting, you said, wildflower seeds?
Right. Well, after almost 20 years of the Abundant Life Seed Foundation, which I started in the mid-'70s, and had developed to a point where we were doing a lot of seed distribution, a lot of seed networking, had seeds in retail outlets in 25 states, printing 40,000 catalogs, and really having a lot of fun doing it. There was a point where I just was attracted more to the wild. And by the wild, I mean, we'd always listed as many native plants as possible. That would be trees, shrubs, wildflowers, and later on I got into native grasses. And there really wasn't a market for it at that time. Maybe we'd sell a few packets in an entire year of a particular flowering bush that was native to the Pacific Northwest, which was our primary market. And there were like a series of events that happened that triggered in me this wish to just go native. And I felt like I've really done everything that I wanted to do with vegetables by now, and maybe it's time to take a leap and see if I can make it as a native plant seedsman. And so I took that leap, and I know we're going to talk more about it later because I know you have some questions for me that will lead to that. But the upshot of it was that right at the same time, by great good fortune, or maybe actually a little bit of calculation, there was a regional movement to start growing more native plants. Up to that time, you would have a hard time finding a lot of the native trees and shrubs in a nursery because, like I say, there was no real market. There was no demand for it. And we had two regional symposiums at that time where hundreds of people came with the same enthusiasm and said, what are we going to do about this? So first off, we got educated, and then a whole bunch of people started nurseries at the same time. And I will say that many of those people are still my clients. It's 24, 25 years later.
Right.
They did make a go of it, and even today, before this call, I filled orders for several of those people.
Wow.
So we're old friends, although some of us have only met once or twice in person. But there's this reliability that, I produce the seeds, they obtain the seeds, they grow their nursery stock, and then they go out into hundreds or thousands of neighborhood gardens, into institutional plantings like schools and parks. And so my clients include many tribes. We have in Washington State over 30 tribal groups, and quite a few of them are my clients. They're revegetating their lands with the things that used to grow there or that have been pressed by development. So they're very committed to recreating the original nature, you might say, as well as parks, the nurseries, and governments. So I have city, county, and state as clients. I have the national government in the form of national forests, national parks. At different times, all these different agencies have come to me for seeds. So that's my clientele. And then, of course, some gardeners, not many most will go to those nurseries and get plants
Get the
rather
plants,
than
exactly.
do the starting themselves from seeds. But
Yeah.
yeah, all those people. So it's really quite diverse and it's very interesting.
Nice. So tell me a little bit about the Abundant Life Seed Foundation and what was your motivation to get that started and what kind of impact did it have?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm very happy to talk about that. At that time, it was very hard to find open-pollinated seeds in the general marketplace, and I was managing those first 2 years in our little natural food store in the neighborhood in Seattle
Uh-huh.
to put out a pretty diverse selection of seeds for people. And I started including flowers and herbs right away. It seemed like there was a need there and it wasn't being met, particularly in the region. So when I first started, I went to a distributor that puts racks out in all the hardware stores and garden centers all over the region
Uh-huh.
and said, I'm interested in getting a rack into our store. What have you got? And what they came up with was the same selection of seeds that, and this was in Seattle, that you might get in Boise or Medford, Oregon. And
right.
those places have really different conditions. They're,
Yeah.
from cool and wet, you've got hot and dry. And yet they put out the same seeds in all those places.
Yeah.
And by that time, I was already well into the bioregional movement, which started up around, well, right after People's Park, actually,
Uh-huh.
and had figured out that we really wanted to be as local as we could be for the benefit of, well, all species.
Uh-huh.
So after the second season of selling seeds in our natural food store, I decided to take a flying leap and start a business just devoted to the seeds and to organic gardening as a neighborhood service.
Right.
And I had a kind of a vision for that. It expressed itself as a mandala, and the mandala looked sort of like an eye in the sense that it was round and it had these different sectors in it. So it kind of divided it into 12 sections like a zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
And each part of it expressed something seasonal, something regional, something educational, something, I guess you could say, commercial, because there would be a product associated with it.
Right.
So that gave me a roadmap. And I thought I would develop that and went looking for a storefront to do that in, and I could not find one in my area. There weren't any empty storefronts around, and it came to be January, and I thought, well, I already know how to package the seeds and do that service for our community. I guess I'll do it by mail.
Oh.
So I printed up a catalog, which was a flat sheet that was folded together origami into a sunflower,
Oh, nice.
and with a little piece of tape to hold it from opening up when it went out in the mail.
Uh-huh.
So it actually broke down into something that was about 6 inches by 6 inches
Mm-hmm.
with a stamp on it. But when you opened it up, it opened like a sunflower, and inside were the listings of all the vegetables, herbs, and flowers and so forth, and books, and a few other things that, was the whole message for that year.
Yeah.
And by the end of that first season, I had been contacted by a number of stores that wanted to display the seeds. So I had 8 retail outlets and mail order customers, and the thing was off and running.
Mm-hmm.
I started it, by the way, on $100.
Nice.
Because it's like seeds themselves. You can grow money if you know how to, let's say, replicate it.
Yeah.
It's an art. So at the end of that season, I began to think, well, I can see where this is leading me. And at that time, I had a friend who had some property, some beautiful rural acres here on the Olympic Peninsula. And we began to talk about the possibility of turning it into a seed farm. And then I thought, well, I guess maybe a nonprofit would be a good way to go about this. And then the nonprofit could be holding the property and growing the enterprises or practices on the property.
Right.
And shortly after that, and before I could actually develop the nonprofit, my friend died.
Oh.
And then there was a all of his circle of people said, well, what's going to happen to the land? We can't let the land be neglected or get sold off by the family because they weren't into all these ideas. He was his own person. So I went ahead and I applied for the nonprofit status, succeeded with that. And by the time I got the nonprofit status, which would then allow people to make donations of cash so we could buy the farm, things had kind of moved on and the family had put the farm up for sale. So in the end, I wound up with the nonprofit as a holding body for the seed work, but the land slipped away and got sold. And it got divided into 3 separate parcels, and right away people started doing different things with the land. And so this 100-year-old homestead with the original fruit trees and all had just slipped away. And I did get to visit it again about 20 years later, and it really was the rundown version of what we were envisioning in 75.
Oh, wow.
So I guess I was relieved to feel like, well, I'm glad I didn't get caught up in that because it didn't go where we would have wanted it to go.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was kind of a tragedy that this very special place became something, much less than what it had its potential to be. It could have been a living history museum, for example. In any case, went on with Abundant Life from there and just began to create a seed network. So always there was a theme of education, that not only are we making these seeds available for everybody to try to grow their own and to use for breeding material if they want to grow different innovative varieties, but also to provide literature that people can learn from, to do the workshops. And it was a membership organization. So before long, we had thousands of members.
Nice.
And making a small contribution, like $10 or $20 a year to support this project.
Right.
And things just rolled along from there to the point where I mentioned earlier, where we had the 25 states with retail outlets, the 40,000 catalogs, the network of about 50 growers spread across about 6 or 8 states. And then, like I said, in 1992, I really got caught up with the idea of working with natives. So I took another flying leap and decided to start Inside Passage Seeds as my sole-owned enterprise. And I was a little bit burned out on group process by then, too.
Yeah, that can get challenging, that's for sure.
The board of directors and so forth, and trying to keep everybody happy, the employees, and it just got to a point where I thought, I'd like to go independent here and kind of start over with a different idea and have a simpler management strategy. So I did that, and it took a while to land on my feet. I know you're going to ask me a question about, I'll preview it, about what I failed at. So this is where the answer will come, but I can save that for later if you prefer.
No, actually, that's a great place to go. How about if we talk about a time you failed?
That. So when I made this decision, the thing that really propelled me to make that decision after the 1992 spring season of distributing the seeds, for one, that year's catalog was really the ultimate of the many unique catalogs we had produced, and I thought, we'll never top this. And it was like an artistic endeavor that I did for 18 years, and I felt like this is the ultimate, so that's not so important now. And then there were newspaper articles that year because I had convinced the local airport to plant wildflowers next to the runways. Short version of that is they had expanded the airport and cleared a lot of land. And in the process of clearing the land, it was kind of brutal, and thousands of people drive past the airport every day, and they were you'd get in line at the post office and the person in front of you would say, "Isn't it terrible about the airport?" So I went down to the commissioners and said, you're losing your public support. I think something you could do there is plant wildflowers. And then I told them that the original land that the airport was put on was a native prairie before 1900, even earlier than that. So when the settlers first came, they built a stockade there because the tribe that was nearest to the airport had been burning that prairie for hundreds of years. That's how you keep it from becoming forested.
Right.
And it had all the edible and medicinal, what we would call wildflowers, but for them, that was their wild garden, maintained by fire. And then it was extirpated by the settlers that came in and just changed the ecology of it completely. So I told the commissioners, you could reclaim part of that original heritage of this land by planting these wildflowers. And they said, okay, we'll put $1,000 into it. So I thought, great, now that'll be my launching into my new business.
Right.
And so it worked. The flowers bloomed. It was quite spectacular. People were coming out with easels and painting these landscapes, and the seeds were growing along the roadside. And so they got picked up by vehicles, tires, for example, and spread down the road. And pretty soon there were lupins growing all over the county. And it was great. But it turned out that there wasn't a market yet. So the failure really was I anticipated this movement, but I got in a little bit early.
A little bit early. That's what we call the bleeding edge, right?
True.
Yeah.
So I went from being basically self-employed and having a livelihood that worked to being almost unemployed and not having enough to live on.
Yeah.
And that was what I would call midlife crisis.
Yeah.
But fortunately, what I mentioned earlier about people starting nurseries at that time, it succeeded. And pretty soon I was actually having a demand for these native seeds, and it became my support again. And I've been living from that now for 20 years. So
Nice.
There was a trough, but I came back up, and things are much better now than they ever were before.
Nice. So what do you consider your biggest success?
Well, just the continuity of finding my calling when I was about 25 or 26 years old, and
beautiful.
following that, and not doubting it ever that this is what I'm here to do. Finding the people that I needed to work with in order to make this life possible, and then continuing to do it. Now I'm 70 years old this year.
Wow.
And I don't see an end. I see role models that I had who were native wildflower seed collectors and dealers who got into their 80s doing this work.
Yeah.
So, as long as you have physical mobility and you always have the skill, you have the knowledge, because you know where to find these things in the wild, then there's really nothing except ultimately decrepitness that's going to stop me from doing this.
Yeah.
And I see that being some years off. So I would say that's a success. And I'm thriving with it, and I have enthusiasm every year to keep doing it.
Nice. So what drives you?
I really want to repair the earth. In the Jewish tradition, there's a word tikkun, tikkun olam, which means the restoration of the earth. And a lot of people are picking that term up now. Not necessarily Jewish people, but it's networking out into the wider community that's the time we are in. We've spent the 20th century tearing the earth apart, and now if we're going to have a planet to survive on, or a biosphere at least, we really need to restore. I don't mean things will ever be just like they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago, but we need to keep all the pieces in this puzzle and put as many of them in place in some capacity as we can so that all species can thrive.
Yeah.
And I see that as possible. I've experienced my own success in that, working with hundreds or thousands of people who are engaged in that work now. And we celebrate that. Each person has their part they can play in it, whether they live in the city, in the country.
Yeah.
There's always a place that is neglected, that's calling out for wildness, that wants to be a habitat that is oppressed. When I was a kid, I used to go and play down by the railroad tracks in my neighborhood. And it was fun because it was wild in the city. It's totally neglected. We would hide in the weeds and play war and things like that.
Yeah.
We would play in the coal dust from the trains. That was probably really bad for my health, but who knew?
Right.
But now I would go into a habitat like that and say, we got to clean up the soil. We have to remediate the spoilage of this site with mushrooms and beneficial bacteria in the soil, microorganisms, make this place healthy, and then plant things that nature intended to be here.
Yeah.
So that's my work.
Beautiful. It sounds like you've done that really well.
Over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm all about education. I have to know, is there one book that has been influential for you in this process?
I'm going to suggest the book that originally turned me on to all of this was Gary Snyder's Earth Household, which was published in around April of 1969,
Wow.
exactly at the same moment as People's Park. So I was open for influence at that point. And Gary
Yeah.
Snyder is possibly America's greatest living poet. He was part of the Beat Poets that included Ginsberg, and he was associate of Jack Kerouac. And I could mention many names that your listeners should know, but many of them don't. But Gary Snyder is still alive in his 80s, and he's had a remarkable life. And his book, Earth Household, is the literal translation of the Greek word ecology.
Oh, nice.
And
Nice.
He laid out some principles in there that right to the heart for me.
Yeah.
And sure enough, after reading the book, after helping with hundreds of other people to launch People's Park, and dropping out of city planning and becoming just a community person for a while, I heard Gary Snyder speak. We had a teach-in at the end of the People's Park movement, and there were some amazing people who came. There were about 4,000 people out in the Sproul Plaza at Berkeley campus. And one after the other, they delivered a message that I know a lot of us got our life directions from that message. And Gary was last. So by that time, most people had left. It was late afternoon, and he said, "Everybody come in close here." And, he dropped the microphone and he said, "It's great what you're doing here. I know this is really important for all of you and for this town. But what you need to do now is really get your feet on the earth and learn some things directly from nature." And so he had two people there who were basically wilderness guides, associates of his. And he said, "You should go out with these men, and they'll take you up in the mountains, and you'll learn all kinds of things that will make your life so much richer." So I did that. And we hiked all over California. I learned the constellations in the sky. I learned many plants. I learned how to fish. I learned things about my own body from being out in the wilderness and sleeping on granite slabs. So I found myself in 1969 in Yosemite National Park at about 9,000 feet with some other backcountry folks. And we looked up at the full moon, and we knew that the first Apollo astronauts had landed on the moon that very day.
Oh my gosh.
This is before I was a seed collector. So in a way, it was kind of like going to the mountain, Moses style, and realizing, what is the human destiny and what is it we're doing here that contrasts with going out into space. And I realized from everything I had learned that year from Gary Snyder, from the People's Park experience, even from the city planning school, that we had to restore the earth. So I basically got my signals right then. And when we came off that mountain, I began to really study plants. I was not a botanist at all, and my experience in the garden was pretty much mowing the grass for my family when I was growing up. In fact, I went home to visit about a year after that, and I looked out of my bedroom window that I had lived in for many years, and for the first time ever, I noticed that the neighbor's yard had an apple tree in it.
Oh my gosh.
So when I was a teenager and growing up, I didn't even realize that there was an apple tree 30 feet from my bed. I didn't have the eyes to see that yet. So that's kind of the personal revolution I went through at that point. And then once I got into the economics of it, I kind of had a natural sense about doing business. I probably learned it from my father. So I just got into it, and it really floats my boat. I really enjoy the buying and selling and trading, and I do a lot of bartering too. It's just fun. It's an exchange of energy with people.
Wow. Especially they landed on the moon while you're standing there watching them in Yosemite. That was epic.
I'll tell you one other thing that happened that day. Quite a day. We were walking across one of the glaciers in Yosemite, and it's not a big glacier, but it's a long, big, snowy mass that eventually ends up in a tarn, which is a glacial lake.
Uh-huh.
And it was July, so a lot of the water was melting and it was pretty slick. And somebody had gone before me and cut footsteps into the glacier with their boots. So the strategy was I just walk in their footsteps and I get across the glacier.
Right.
Well, a little ways out, it gave way and I slid and I started to go down the glacier really fast. And conceivably would have wound up in that glacial lake and died. It was a life-threatening experience.
Uh-huh.
But just as I started sliding down, there was a big boulder, a dark-colored rock, and maybe 10 feet tall. And the sun warming that rock had melted a little trough around the rock. So as I went by, I was able to hook my arm on the rock, and I slipped right into the trough, and that was the end of the slide.
Wow.
It's kind of like a life-saving miracle.
Yeah.
And then I just walked around the rock, and I was able to get out the other side and just start over. And I actually wound up going all the way over the top of the glacier. I didn't want to try to cross it a second time.
Yeah.
But that was quite a day.
I'll say. So, wow, what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
Follow your dream. That's my life experience.
I was going to say, it sounds like you've done that.
Yeah, I had these clues along the way, and there were risks. Like, what if this fails? Will I wind up at a desk job working in some company that I don't really have the same values with?
Yeah.
Well, that never happened. I guess I'm fiercely independent that way, and I've had some challenging times in the early 80s where I was barely making it. Mm-hmm. But somehow or other, I always pulled through. I will say that once, in that time when I started Inside Passage, and it took about 2 years to get things to a level where I could actually live on the business, my mother came through for me, and she loaned me some money so that I could make it through that time.
Yeah.
And that was, as I said, the time that was the most challenging, the midlife crisis.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's been a great ride for the last 45 years.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your experience with us today, Forrest. It's been a treat getting to chat with you.
You're welcome. I appreciate what you're doing. When I visited your website, I saw a lot of friends of mine who you've spoken with before in other podcasts, and a few that, of course, that I didn't know. So I'll probably spend more time there picking up on what other people are doing all over this country.
Perfect. So how can our listeners get a hold of you?
They can go to my website, which is insidepassageseeds.com.
Perfect.
And they will find about 200 seed listings there of trees, shrubs, wildflowers, and grasses of the Pacific Northwest. And really the intended audience for that is in the Pacific Northwest. That's why it's called Inside Passage, which of course are the waters on the Northwest coast.
Right.
As well, I have customers in Germany, Australia, New Zealand.
Wow.
Different parts of the United States, certainly across the northwest of Canada. Mm-hmm. And people are always up for trying new things. And for many, these flowers are going to be really special if they have the right environment to grow them in.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Decades ago, I started growing food in my front and backyard, and I realized that my mission in life is to inspire and empower others to grow their own nutrient-dense, healthy organic food. Because of this, a lot of people have come to me with their gardening questions over the years, and that got me thinking, what if we put together a community that would help budding gardeners blossom? So I finally made the idea a reality with my Urban Farm U member program. Each month, your membership includes 3 live online events, a monthly class, a chit-chat with an expert, and a monthly coaching session, plus access to the experts on our member page and a significant discount on our signature courses. I'm deeply committed to transforming our global food system, and I do this by empowering you to grow your own food. The Urban Farm membership program is a simple way to get going. Please join me in transforming your food system today. To learn more, go to urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444. That's urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.